recording. I think we are live. Thank you very much, Robert, for coming.
Thank you for inviting me.
With Robert Geraci. I hope I pronounced your name right. Thing is that your name sounds Italian very much, but how is it that you pronounce it?
It is Italian. We pronounce it Geraci, but that's
Geraci.
mostly just because we're lazy Americans and we're not going to get people to pronounce it correctly.
Okay. So Geraci is actually a quite not that common, but common enough name in southern Italy. I am from southern Italy myself. However, you are a professor of religion studies at the Manhattan College in New York, right?
That's correct.
And I enjoyed very much reading your two books. The first book of Robert, Apocalyptic AI. It is a book about modern transhumanism considered as a modern religion, which is a point of view which some people don't like too much, but myself, I find that it makes perfect sense. I do recommend much reading Apocalyptic AI. The second book of Robert was called Virtually Sacred. It is an exploration of religion in an extended sense in virtual worlds, where you cover both World of Warcraft and the Second Life. In fact, I remember that we met a few years ago. Second Life was a bit more popular than today. Now I'm afraid that virtual worlds are falling very much out of fashion. We hope that can change when most people start using immersive reality environment, Oculus Rift, full 360 degrees immersion and all that. I hope that happen, because I think virtual worlds are a very useful, convenient, interesting and fun communication environment. This environment that we are using now, we can consider it as a light, simple virtual reality. It doesn't offer too many graphical embellishments, but it does get work done. I understand you're writing another book, right?
That's correct. About religion and technology in India.
And in fact, I found very interesting your recent article, A Tale of Two Futures, Techno-Eschatology, in the US and India. I think we can also say techno-eschatology, the Western world and India. In this article, if I understand your points well, you continue where you left in Apocalyptic AI and say that modern futurist and transhumanism are a special religious sensibility typical of our times, and you repeat the same considerations that you made in Apocalyptic AI about the Western world, but also add some counterparts specific to the Indian society, religion, and cultural environment. And a very interesting consideration that you make is that also in India can consider modern futurism inspired by science as a continuation of the classical traditions. You add that that way of saying things, the future as a continuation of the past, modern science as a continuation of the religious traditions may be much more popular in India than it has been in the West, correct?
Well, what I was trying to argue in that essay is that when you think about the future of technology and the way that technology gets incorporated into a culture, there will always be religious considerations that, especially when we start thinking, for those who aren't, experts in the field, the word eschatology is probably a really confusing one. Eschatology means a theory about the end of time, right? And when we think about technology, we automatically start thinking about progress. And it's very common for people to start thinking about progress in these very religiously oriented ways. In Apocalyptic AI, I talk about the kind of radical expectation of a new world, the kind of end of this world as we know it and the beginning of a new world. And we see that when people talk about transitioning minds into machines, people uploading minds into virtual worlds or into robots. We start talking about a whole new world at that point. So that's what apocalyptic AI kind of engages, that theory about this transition into a machine future, right? That technology is allegedly progressing toward. And one of the things that's sort of interesting in my observations of India is that you also see people working with their indigenous scales of time or conceptions of time and thinking about how technological progress fits within those. So in India, the traditional calendars are built around a very old system called the Yuga cycle, and in the Yuga cycle, instead of time progressing from some beginning point to some end point, time progresses cyclically, that we experience a process of degeneration from the kind of very, very good beginning down to a very, very bad period, which then cycles back to the very, very good period again. And that cycle happens indefinitely. So when you think about eschatology in kind of Judeo-Christian terms, you think about the beginning of the world and the end of the world and the new world to come. When you think about the end times in India, you're more likely to think about them as a return to some prior state and a continuation of that cycle. And so what was interesting to me was that even with this very different conception of time, people still can use technology as a kind of as evidence for the process of time, right? Instead of looking at, say, artificial intelligence and robotic vision and everything else as showing us that we're getting to this point where time radically changes. In India, you get people using it to talk about the Yuga cycle. I mean, you actually have antecedents going back to the 19th and early 20th century where people talk about how modern science shows that we're making progress in the Yuga cycle from the depths of the Kali age, the Kali Yuga, to a return to Satya Yuga, which is the pristine first state.
Whoa, is there an equivalent in India
So
of
it's
the...
the piece is really about kind of. I didn't catch that, Julio.
All right. Is there an equivalent in India of the very radical, wild futurism find, for example, in the works of Hans Moravec or Ray Kurzweil?
So that was one of the things that was really interesting to me when I was first in India, which was in 2012 to 2013. I'd gotten a Fulbright Award to go to the Indian Institute of Science, which is the finest scientific establishment in India, and interview people in the city of Bangalore. So I was there and talking to people in academia, both at the Indian Institute of Science, but also at other prestigious institutions in Bangalore, like the National Center for Biological Sciences and the Nehru Center for Advanced Scientific Research and similar. But I was also talking to people in industry and a couple of people in hacker culture kind of environments or communities. And what I found was, especially among kind of what we might call the old guard of academia, they were pretty dismissive of Western style futurism. A number of people had heard, particularly of Kurzweil, but they didn't think it was very well thought out or very likely, and were not fans. Now, that said, there were other communities where it was more common. Among younger students, they frequently were better versed in kind of Hollywood science fiction and were perhaps thinking a little more along those lines. And one of the most fascinating people that I met there was a woman who, she and her husband, unfortunately, this isn't on the internet anymore. She actually doesn't know what happened to it. They did a switch in how they were running their website and their blog, but there was a woman who, she and her husband started what amounts to kind of a community art collective, and she had written an essay on the internet about the rise of an internet god in Bangalore. And so I got to talk to her, and she was tremendously interesting, and was of the impression that some of the kind of futurist promises that we see could in fact come to fruition. But at present, those radical futurist ideas are they're not prevalent the way they are in the United States. And many of the people I interviewed, they just said, "Hey, we've got a lot of problems to solve here. Like, we need clean water before we can worry about uploading our minds into robots."
Well, I guess that is a point of view and an objection, radical futurism, that you can also hear very frequently here in the West.
Yeah, I mean, we still have lots of problems to solve too, right? I mean,
Right.
when you look at environmental problems or problems of poverty and education, we have a lot we need to uh, get sorted out.
And in fact, so I am radical futurist myself, and I'm very much committed to these ideas. I would 100% agree. Uploading our minds to computer is fun, is very cool, it is important, but it's not as important as solving other problems in the world today. It is important, but on a priority scale, it cannot come on the first place. And I would also agree with some critics of our ideas that the scales imagined by transhumanists like Ray Kurzweil are, I'm afraid, very much over-optimistic. I believe things will happen much slower than that. And therefore, we shouldn't, or at least I don't personally expect to see the possibility of uploading my mind to a computer within my lifetime. One of the reasons why I tend to focus on a different interpretation of our ideas that does not necessarily require things to happen too fast. I think that's a big advantage of my own religious interpretation of our ideas. The advantage is that I'm not in a very big hurry. I don't want to see everything happening tomorrow.
Yeah, well, there's a
Uh,
long tradition in Jewish and Christian apocalyptic thought that the world is supposed to be ending, tomorrow, right? If you go back, for example, and you pick up the New Testament and you read chapter 13 of the Gospel of Mark, for example, what's called the Markan Apocalypse, Jesus implies that the new kingdom is in the immediate future. If you read the letters of Paul, he says that this is all going to happen in Paul's own lifetime. He says Paul doesn't expect to die. And as a general rule, I mean, this is a sense in which you yourself are not really apocalyptic, right? You see a religious thing happening with what you're doing, but it's really not apocalyptic, because apocalyptic movements are almost universally convinced that the world's about to end right now. And Kurzweil's a perfect example of that. You know, he's convinced that, you know, by 2039, we're going to all upload our minds into robots and what have you. And that's just, um, as much as he would like to build that on the basis of kind of, look how we've had progress in this domain and that domain, and that means that these magical things are going to happen, you know, in the immediate future. It's not an evidence-based claim. You can't, that the future is going to bring these things. It's really a faith-based claim that the future, the immediate future, will bring these things. And so your long view is not apocalyptic the way Kurzweil's is, right? Your long view is that, hey, look, it seems reasonable that the technologies can do this. Whereas, you know, at least as I understand you, I mean, we've known each other for a long time now, and actually, I think it's really fascinating that we have such overlap. Both of us are so interested in the way technology is about the enchantment of the world and meaning making. Um, you on a kind of constructing that, you know, helping to construct that worldview, and me, you know, describing or engaging with it. But for Kurzweil, that meaning and that enchantment has to happen right now. He's expecting radical changes in the very, very near future. And even the people in India that I talked to were kind of willing to believe that such things might be possible. Most of them didn't think it was happening on the kind of time scale that Kurzweil or Hans Moravec or someone might advocate or expect.
Right. And in fact, I do think it's very likely that the radical future that Ray Kurzweil imagined, I think sooner or later that will happen. I believe that,
Mm-hmm.
for example, by the end of this century, we might have conscious artificial intelligence, perhaps smarter than human. During the next century, we may be able to upload our minds to computer and move to cybernetic state way of life. Moravec thought, but I don't have any hope that that might happen by 2030 or 2045 or within my lifetime. I mean, it will happen, but not tomorrow, not next week. It will take much more time. But then, and I think that's also a way of psychological interpretation of different interpretations of transhumanism. I mean, I 100% agree with Ray Kurzweil in the sense that I would like not to die. Right? Fortunately, based on my scientific knowledge, no way that may happen within my lifetime. Uh, I don't have any grandchildren now. Perhaps if in a few years I will have grandchildren, I could see the possibility that might happen in their lifetime. Unfortunately, not mine, not my lifetime. Of course, I don't like the idea of death. I don't like to think that we are all doomed to permanent and irreversible oblivion. So why? I sort of project my wish to avoid death to the very far future and imagine some kind of future technology able to resurrect the people who died in the past. It's a quite old idea, and you describe that in the article. What you say, I'm going to read that, as machines grow to superhuman intelligence, humanity will upload consciousness into machine bodies and join the artificial intelligence. Moravec calls the mind fire, a cosmic expansion of intelligence throughout the universe. Now, this is still traditional transhumanism. It's very visionary, but it's something that most transhumanists would accept. A few lines after that, you say that thanks to vast computation, even the dead shall rise and walk again. This digital wonderland, resurrected through historical analysis. Now this, and of course the meaning of what you say have to be described perhaps in more words, is something where is the point where some transhumanists would start to disagree, especially the very rationalist transhumanists who want to keep as far as possible from anything that sounds like religion. As a matter of fact, I went to look in Hans Moravec book to find source, one of the sources of these ideas. He puts it in a beautiful way. He says that minds intermediate between Sherlock Holmes and God will process clues in solar system quantities to deduce and recreate most microscopic details of preceding eras, entire world histories with all their living, feeling inhabitants will be resurrected cyberspace. That's what Moravec said in Robot, Mere Machine to Transcend the Mind. This concept of technological resurrection is still very much for most futurists to swallow, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a huge diversity of opinion in the transhumanist communities, right? You have transhumanists who have, first of all, we should probably stop for a moment and say, to some extent, every single human being alive is transhumanist. There's no human being who doesn't use technology to try to transcend his or her limits, right?
And
So
that's
all of us.
the demonstration, isn't it? I wasn't able to ride the screen. Now I'm putting my eyeglasses on, and I'm able to ride again. That's transhumanism, isn't it?
Uh, and, you know, but then within the people who might identify themselves as transhumanists, you have some people who, for whom that means looking for pills that might keep them youthful forever or health forever or so forth, and might reject the kind of really radical idea that you might want to upload your mind into a robot or that we might be resurrecting the dead through computer simulation. You have a wide spectrum of belief there. But then, as you said, even those who accept the more radical promises frequently will say, yeah, but it's not religious. But at that point, it really comes down to two things. One, what your definition of religion is, and two, whether or not you have a knee-jerk reaction to being called religious. And that, for me as a scholar, has been of kind of an ongoing presence, because when I interview in the transhumanist community or present my research in the transhumanist community, people will always tell me they're not religious, that they're philosophical maybe, but they frequently say they're scientific or whatever else. And I just tell people, don't worry. First of all, I'm not judging you by calling it religious. I mean, I'm a scholar of religion. I'm comfortable with religion. I think religion can do terrible things, and I think religion can do wonderful, great, beautiful things. And we can all focus on the better side and try to make those happen more often than the other. But the other the other issue, the definition I use, I take from a historian of religions. His name is David Chittister. He's in South Africa, and he defines religion as the negotiation of what it means to be human with respect to the superhuman and the subhuman. So that negotiation takes place through doctrine, through ritual, through symbols, through texts, all those things that are trying to help you understand the meaning of human life. And then he says, with respect to the superhuman and subhuman. And when you look at someone like Moravec, and Moravec tells us that we're going to have computers that are effectively gods, we're going to upload our minds into machines and become immortal. Well, then we're talking about superhuman beings, superhuman powers, superhuman states of being. So at that point, it becomes, by David Chittister's definition, religious. And I'm comfortable with that definition. And actually, I have on occasion done interviews with people in the transhumanist community who said, well, I'm not comfortable with you calling this religious. And then I say, okay, well, here's what I mean by that. And then they've said, okay, that's all right. I can talk to you, right? Like, I don't happen to agree with that definition of religion, but I can talk to you, right? Like, I understand where you're coming from. So I think it helps a lot to diffuse some of the kind of politics of religion, to talk about what that word might mean. And once you have a sense for what it might mean, that allows you to then take a more analytical perspective that's not based on your emotional perspective, right? Your emotional perspective might be, I think religious people, however I'm creating that category, are dogmatic or irrational or violent or whatever else, and I don't want to be part of that. But if we take a step back and we say, well, that's not necessarily what I mean by religion, then we can make progress, and it's not about emotion so much anymore. It becomes about a reasoned conversation. But within that perspective, the people that the people and the ideas that I engage, they are religious ideas. I mean, that was partly what led me to go to India. Was I wanted to know how I had thought for many years about how Western Judeo-Christian kind of religious ideas were implicated in technological progress and technological life. And I wanted to go somewhere where the religious ideas were very different and say, how do those, affect the way people think about technology? And to go back to that question you asked earlier, while radical Western futurism, there's a whole chapter in the book that I'm finishing on Western style futurism. My guess is that it's growing. And I think the work that you're doing and that India Awakens under Nupur Munshi, that is reflective of a kind of growing awareness of futurist technologies that I think are hard to not. I think they become part of the technological imaginary when you've got a country full of mobile phones, right? I mean, even in a place where India's poverty is still a profound problem, people have mobile phones and they're carrying with them this digital transcendence, this ability to communicate with their friends and their family across long distances. If they've saved up enough money to get a smartphone, then they have the internet at their fingertips. And that is a concrete manifestation of radical futurist promises, right? Now, it's not just because we have mobile phones doesn't mean we're going to upload our minds to robots. Unlike you, I'm skeptical of that idea. I've actually, I have enough issues keeping my computer from crashing that the idea that I want to put my mind into one is a very problematic one for me personally. But I still think it's a fascinating, interesting idea. And I think that the presence of things like smartphones lends a lot of credence to that kind of idea. And I think what we're seeing in India is the ramping up of those futurist ideas that they become. We will see over the next 10 and 20 years, those ideas become more common in India than they are now, much more common. Just as if you go back 20 years in the US, very few people were publicly talking about things like mind uploading. But just a couple of years ago, we had a Johnny Depp movie come out, the movie Transcendence, in which he uploads his mind into a computer, right? Shortly after that, the movie Her came out, where a guy falls in love with his computer, right? And then all the, spoiler, at the end, all the super smart computers, they transmit their minds away from the Earth. They decide they're going to go explore another galaxy or something like that. I can't quite remember how it works, but these ideas that 20 years ago, Hans Moravec was kind of leading the charge on, and then Ray Kurzweil picked up on them and really distributed them very powerfully. So we've seen big changes here in the US. I'm not in Europe often enough to have a sense. Perhaps you could speak to your perception of how futurism and the talk around futurism and the public awareness of that has evolved in Europe. But in the US, we've seen in 20 years a lot of growth. I think we'll see a lot of growth in places like India over the coming 20 years.
I don't think Europe is that different from the US in that respect. The US and Europe sort of advanced together in the good or perhaps in a not so good direction. But in both cases, I wouldn't entirely agree with what you just said. Because, yes, of course, we do have now much better technological gadgets that we had in the 90s, and radical futurist ideas like mind uploading are known to many more people, thanks especially to movies like Transcendence and Hair. Yes, that's a fact, but at the same time, sort of miss the very radical enthusiasm or radical futurism that we had in the 90s. The thing is that then we had a very small community of very enthusiastic people with very radical and visionary idea. Now we have a wider community. Our ideas are known and perhaps understood by more people. I kind of see that the enthusiasm has been sort of lost, which doesn't happen only in this case, sort of a general involution of our society after, I think, perhaps September 11 was the switching point. The decades after the 90s, previous one and this one, were much less enthusiastically optimistic in the 90s.
Yeah.
And I think
Well,
that's a trend
if
that
I
I
could
don't like
interrupt
too
you,
much. Yeah, sure.
I think there's actually a fascinating parallel in the origins of Christianity. Imagine how excited the early Christians were when they were thinking about the return of Jesus. After Jesus gets crucified, first of all, they're really, really upset, right? It's traumatic for Jesus to be crucified. But as they work out their theology, they get very excited that Jesus is going to back and inaugurate the kingdom of God and all that. And when in the year 70, when the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, and Jesus didn't come back right then, there was a huge crisis of faith right there, and people were concerned that the beautiful future wasn't coming after all, right? But many people held on to their faith, and they recalibrated their faith, and they thought about how they were going to do it, and they were able to make their faith a quite general, eventually it became very, very common, very popular, and even effectively took over Europe, right? And there might be a parallel there to the kind of early excitement of the late 80s and the 90s in the transhumanist community, where you just had a few people and the ideas were new and they were out there. I mean, in some sense, they weren't really new because they actually had a century-long history to them. But they were, first of all, being expressed in a new and popular way, and second of all, being integrated into computers, and that was a different thing. And on top of that, people had computers in front of them to make the promises kind of plausible in a way that they might not have been previous to that. And then I think you're right, though, that 9/11 kind of inaugurated, kind of a season of disappointment, right? Where people are angry, they're looking for kind of who ruined the world. I mean, we're seeing this in our U.S. political election right now, of course, right? Where the popularity of Donald Trump kind of emerges out of A, he's loud and bombastic, and people, for whatever reason, sometimes find that appealing. But B, the kind of conversation that someone over there is to blame for my problems, right? The world is messed up. I mean, in the history of this country, I don't know that anybody ever ran for president on the premise that America has collapsed and is a terrible place to live. What a weird premise. Say this country is terrible and I want to lead it. I mean, that's an insane idea, right? So we're definitely seeing, that season of disappointment has really wide-ranging effects. But even in the midst of it, we're seeing the kind of, so here I guess maybe I'm trying to give you some hope for your ideas and your community, is that we're also seeing the widespread distribution of the ideas that were so exciting to people in the 1990s. When you can have TV shows that talk about the singularity, when you can have movies and video games and kind of this sort of constant talk about whether it's genetic engineering to create, smart babies or what have you, or a pill that will make you live to be 300 years old, or the possibility that you might inhabit a virtual world. The routinization of the idea is one that might actually mean more than the enthusiasm, right? The enthusiasm of a small few is probably less, think about it again to compare it to that early Christian period when it was just a small group of Jews who followed Jesus. That was never going to be a profound world movement. It was when Paul of Tarsus brought Christianity to the Gentiles and routinized Jesus, right? Like brought Jesus and made him available to all these other people. We might, I'm not a fortune teller, right? But we might be saying something like that, where these ideas are being brought to the public in a way that will distribute them very widely and make lots of people into potential believers that this is possible and this is, the way that we want the future to go.
You're right. I really hope you're right. Now, let's abandon for a moment Western religious and scientific terminology, and let's try to see if we can say very similar things using a completely different language. It's this Akashic language, and you see here that illustrate the concept, I have chosen an image that doesn't look scientific at all. The concept was introduced in the West, I think, by the end
Is
of
that image
last.
Alex Gray?
I don't know. It's just the first thing that I found on
Okay.
the internet, googling
Okay.
Akashic records. Is a yogi in a library with some thing that suggests that digital things are happening. I think the concept was introduced by the end of the 19th century, and A.P. Sinnett in esoteric Buddhism first describe a permanency of records in the Akasha, the potential capacity of man to read the same, and he has evolved to I think I need to go closer to read to the stage of individual enlightenment. That was one of the first popularizations in the West of the concept of Akashic records, and then it was also used by Theosophian and Madame Blavatsky. I think these kind of ideas were kind of reasonably popular around at the end of the 19th century. Now, when this guy thought about the possibility to read the Akashic records, I think he had something spiritual in mind. I don't think he was thinking about science and technology. I don't think he was even contemplating the idea of a technology able to find, read, and use the Akashic records. But that is exactly what I would like to do now. I think this idea of Akashic physics, engineering, finding out exactly how these things could exist and these things could happen, I believe, besides being a very interesting challenge for our science, also be a cultural fusion of Eastern and Western cultures, which is something that I believe the world very much needs. Just to give an idea of how modern scientists are reusing Akashic terminology, I will read the description of Erwin Laszlo in the Akashic experience of a universal information and memory field that could exist in nature, associated with the fundamental element of physical reality that physicists call the unified field. And he says, honoring an ancient insight, this is the aspect of dimension of the unified field that I have called the Akashic field. More recently, two scientists, and they were both my guests in one of the previous videos of this series of conversation. The mathematician Ralph Abraham and the Indian physicist Sisir Roy have written a book called Demystifying the Akasha, where they tried to build a possible theoretical foundations for Akashic physics with a cosmic memory that remembers everything that ever happens. Their work is based on a dynamic cellular network, a generalization of cellular automata concept that has been popularized by Stephen Wolfram. Is something that exists outside of space and time, but kind of generates what we perceive as a space and time through an emergence process. I'm not going to go into detail about that, but I'm mentioning this as an example of the fact that many modern scientists are taking the idea of Akashic memory seriously and trying to analyze it with science. Nobody is really designing Akashic engineering yet. Perhaps that kind of developments will come. I think if science would start this extremely ambitious research program, and in the far future we could acquire the capability read the information in the Akashic records, use this information to resurrect the dead by reading the information from the past and uploading it to the future. Now, I understand that, like the majority of people, you are kind of skeptical of these ideas. You would not really take these ideas seriously as a science or as a religion, sociology perhaps, nothing more than that. However, for the rest of the conversation, to ask you to kind of suspend disbelief on the remote plausibility of the ideas that I'm describing. I don't want to convert you, and I don't want you to recognize that I'm right. I'd like you to entertain the idea that perhaps I could be right. And for that, I'm going to just say a few things before coming to the question part. A few things about the work of contemporary scientists in related fields. Scientists who do not use the Akashic terminology, for example, in a book, this is a science fiction book of Arthur C. Clarke and Stephen Baxter. They wrote a science fiction book called The Light of Other Days. First, a very good book from a literary point of view. It's also interesting scientifically because it shows how a future society could develop resurrection technology, exploiting micro wormholes that exist naturally in space and time. You just imagine that there are microscopic connection between every pixel of space and time and every other pixel of space and time. So that by exploiting these micro wormholes, you could access information that exists in other places and also in other times. If a novel, a future society develop resurrection technology based on these ideas. Well, okay, this is science fiction. It is science fiction, but the same ideas are studied more and more frequently by real scientists who study real science. In the context, for example, of quantum gravity and the relation between quantum entanglement and the structure of space and time. All these researchers, they don't use the Akashic terminology at all, but I think they are basically saying very similar things with different words. And in another video chat of this series of conversations, we had Frank Tipler. Is an entirely different concept of resurrection technology. He doesn't use the Akashic terminology at all. I think he wouldn't like it at all. But at the end of the day, he gets the same place, which is the idea of constructing the past in very high detail by studying the traces that past events have left the structure of reality. And this is the concept that is often called quantum archaeology. What do archaeologists do? They go digging in places with a lot of sand and a lot of old things, and a lot of work can uncover information from the past that you and I would not even believe would be uncovered. We do know now a lot of details of the daily life in prehistorical cultures that the archaeologists have found by examining very little and very difficult to find the uh, traces that these people alive thousands of years ago have left. Now, here in the picture, I have an archaeological finding of a skull. That's what we can do now. We can find a skull. We cannot find what was inside the skull. We cannot find and we cannot read the thoughts that were in the physical brain was in that skull thousands of years ago. We can imagine and entertain the notion that perhaps future physicists use some of the very weird effect that quantum physicists are finding today to not only see the skull, but also to see what was inside the skull. You can read the information that was in the mind of the poor guy here, then perhaps we could correct this guy by uploading him or her to the future. And of course, that is not something that happens next week, not something that happens next year. It will take a very, very long time, if at all, our descendants to develop these really magic technologies. But I like to contemplate the idea that might happen, and that our descendants, or perhaps even some future alien civilization, would resurrect us alive here today, also the people in the past, based on what I can only call a magic physics, in the sense of Arthur C. Clarke third law. I think this will be a much needed cultural fusion of East and West. On one hand, we would have Eastern ethereal spirituality, openness to holistic models of reality, and on the other hand, we would have the can-do engineering spirit of Western technology. I believe Nikola Tesla, something like that. And of course, you have the same idea in the work of Nikolai Fyodorov and the Russian cosmists at the end of the 19th century. So I'm here defining as Akashic engineering any future technology able to exploit the deep structure of physical reality to magic engineering and resurrect dead from the past. And I think that a religion 2.0 based on the prospect of Akashic engineering be a very desirable future of Eastern and Western culture, and a very desirable fusion of science and technology. And but I think now I want to come to some specific questions to you. First, I see that you have been very patient and very silent for the last few minutes. What do you think of the strange things that I just said?
Well, I think we should start by unpacking a few issues. I should admit I have not read Abraham and Roy's book, so I don't have a sense of the model they're trying to propose. All the time, I think, when we want to talk about, say, what we're going to call Eastern religion or Indian religious ideas or so forth, any kind really of religious ideas and scientific or technical ideas, I think we need to be really wary of the idea that because something resembles another thing, that they might actually be the same thing. Um, so like if you pull out the 19th century guy talking about Akashic records, and then you pull out, you know, 20th, 21st century automata theory or quantum physics or digital computers, and then you say, yeah, but the one it kind of sort of looks like the other, so maybe they could be the same thing. I think we have to be deeply cautious of that as a strategic move. And the reason for that is not only that it can lead us analytically astray, but actually it gets roped up into some pretty serious politics, especially part of my own research on India that we talked about shortly before this began is about nationalist politics. And there actually is a long tradition in India of trying to argue. This is now almost 150-year long tradition, and it has its roots in anti-colonialism. It actually has really sensible, good roots for why this idea emerged. But there's a long tradition trying to say, oh, that stuff of science is in, this theological idea. And while that was fine in the midst of colonialism and Indians trying to develop a sense of uh, identity that could resist colonial oppression, that's problematic in the 21st century because it actually might lead away from where you were going at the end of what you were saying. Like, let's talk about how to get a science that can do certain kinds of work. That might actually be harder to get to uh, if we, instead of just saying, hey, I'm calling it Akashic because I think that makes for a nice kind of metaphor or whatever, if we confuse ourselves into thinking that conceptual categories are the same, I think that might go in problematic directions, right? So we have to keep the terminologies clear and accept that even if inspiration might be coming from a particular religious idea, it's really unlikely that that particular religious idea actually maps on to the scientific and technical ideas that interest you, right? I mean, it's possible, but unlikely, right? So just in terms of a conceptual move, we probably have to be really wary there, right? Um, Now, I think you've offered in very brief a wonderful illustration of how technology can be part of the meaning making process of humanity, that we want what we're doing to be meaningful. We want uh, the world around us to be meaningful. And this quantum archaeology project can become part of that and can help address perhaps the some of the malaise that people might see in the contemporary moment, right? Give people something optimistic, a project to be looking for. Um, but one other conceptual issue before we move on from there is that I get uncomfortable if you say Eastern spirituality and Western science and engineering. And that's because the history of science doesn't really tell us that India lacked in science and engineering. Now, by the time the British showed up with guns and steamships, the British were far in advance in certain technologies. Although at that time, India was more advanced in textile manufacture and metallurgy. For example, there were a couple of domains in which, steel making in India was better than it was in other places. Um, and that as a process of economic activities and industrialization, India took a step backwards in some of its technical know-how. Um, so I don't want to encourage the idea that somehow India lacked for science and technology, even though once the scientific revolution happened in Europe, technologies developed in a way that allowed Europe to rapidly expand beyond the capacity of other parts of the world. Um, at the same time, the idea that people are spiritual in the East and not in the West is another one that I find, like that's a pretty dubious idea for me. And as evidence of that, I would point, in fact, toward the transhumanist idea, where, if you go to the mind uploading and that kind of thing, those are deeply spiritual ideas for me. And they're built right into the technological system. So I don't want to discourage Western spirituality. It exists. There's a real thing there, right? And I don't want to discourage the idea that there's science and technology in India, and especially because those political categories really, really mattered, right? If you go back to British rule in India, they were very happy to say Indians are spiritual but not technical. And then that became a tool by which Indians were excluded from technical education. They weren't allowed to build technical or scientific universities. And then they weren't allowed to have jobs in technical areas, right? So that terminology has been a weapon, right? And so I think we have to both recognize the kind of violence that has happened historically with that terminology, and then make sure that insofar as we want to use it, that we want to use it in ways that are really productive, right? So those are the conceptual areas that I think have to kind of get unpacked before we even move on to the idea of, okay, what might we think about this idea of Akashic engineering as a kind of spiritual quest that is deeply grounded in science and technology, that accepts the methods of science and technology. And that's really, really important, right? The method question. Because if you go back to that 19th century Buddhist guy, the guy who, I don't remember quite what that, Sinnett, his book, he's not going to be interested in the empirical methods of science and technology, even if he's comparing contemporary Western ideas and Indian thought. So
if I can interrupt you one moment, Robert, before you move on. I just want to say that I 100% agree on the second point you made about the fact that speaking of Eastern spirituality and Western technology is very much misleading. In fact, I don't like this terminology myself, because it gives the very wrong idea that the East has a monopoly on spirituality,
yeah,
the West has a monopoly on technology, and these things are not at all. I'm using this terminology because I cannot find a better one to give exactly
it's
the
difficult.
idea that I want to give. I mean, when you speak of fusion of Eastern spirituality, Western technology, even if the concept is not only imprecise but wrong, I get most people would understand
Yeah,
immediately what I mean. Of course, I would like very much to find an alternative formulation that is not wrong, and I will keep thinking about it. If you
yeah,
have any
yeah.
suggestion, I would very much like to hear it.
I could. I'll have it in my head. I don't have anything off the top of my head that I could suggest. I think. I mean, fundamentally, what you're proposing is a global project, right? You want people everywhere to unite behind this idea that we can use the methods of science and technology to progress in science and technology, and that progress will also be a kind of spiritual progress, right? That progress would allow the fulfillment of certain kinds of religious goals or aspirations, which are deeply human goals and aspirations. I don't know anyone who's lost a loved one to death who doesn't still wish he or she could talk to that person from time to time, right? This is a deeply human thing. And so there's no surprise that we've kind of built it into most of our religious traditions, ways of communicating with folks. And in that sense, it's also no surprise that you or others might want to use science and technology to accomplish that end. I mean, that fusion makes perfect sense to me, right? Because it is so human, right? And my presumption is that people would want that fusion, but not be sure how to make it necessarily. And one of the things you asked me in email was, hey, is this more likely to fly in India than, say, in the United States? And I think that might be the case, at least at present in India. That might be the case. Um, but I don't think it's an impossible speculation for US and Europe. I think people are still interested in those kinds of ideas. I mean, I was just in August, I went and visited a small town called Lilydale. It's an old spiritualist town in New York where to live there, you have to either be or be related to a registered medium. You have to be someone who talks to the deceased. And they have services, and I went and I joined for a couple of services, and there were people, and the mediums would come up, and the mediums would talk supposedly with deceased relatives or friends of people in the audience. So it was a pretty interesting experience for me. Um, I think people are called toward that. And um, if the technology progressed, I mean, I'm I'm not clear what could be getting stored in the fabric of the universe that would allow us to know, for example, what someone was thinking 1,000 years back. But that doesn't mean there isn't something being stored that way. I just don't know what it might be. Um, it may be that what you're proposing as an idea is slightly ahead of its time, right? That if it got to the point that our fairly clearly defined rules and laws of physics indicate that data about what's happening are being stored in a really high resolution, rich kind of way, then it would then all of a sudden this idea of the resurrection, right, becomes plausible. Um, so
Uh,
the question is whether you can motivate that with the idea of Akashic engineering, like, hey, we have to do this kind of scientific work, or whether the scientific work has to precede the, make Akashic engineering compelling. And I don't know which of those has to come first, whether we have to drive the science with a philosophy, with a worldview,
mm.
or whether we need the science to ground the worldview.
Well, I think this is a very interesting point because I mean it is a feedback loop, and the scientific part of it is happening. Things that I don't want to go into details of physics, which I don't really understand myself as well as I would like to understand. I'm dedicating a lot of time and study to this, finding the concept of future Akashic engineering in the theoretical physics which is happening now. The thing is that the physics is happening already. Don't use the same terminology that I'm using. They would never speak of resurrecting the dead. Where you are a professor, you know that for a researcher in academy, if you don't already have a Nobel Prize, it would be career suicide. They are very careful in never to say anything that resembles even remotely the way I am putting it. But yes, I see a lot of things that are happening in science that don't give final evidence yet for the possibility of Ashik engineering, but somehow suggest the idea that the possibility that the past is always stored in the fabric of reality is very, very much compatible with what scientists are finding out right now. It's not going to become technology next year. We are beginning to see very interesting hints that things could actually be like that. So the science is happening. It's just a matter of translating the very dry terminology used by the scientists in in language that is more emotionally appealing. I think the science is there. Is the other leg of the process that at this moment I'm more interested in, which is to popularize among common people like you and I the knowledge that things are happening in modern science that kind of point the way to the possibility. All the things that I'm saying actually make sense. In fact, I think that's a good introduction for this question that I have displayed here. What is the natural target audience for our ideas in view of the consideration that we just made? Should we be talking to first?
Well, the unfortunate thing for you, I think, is that you're stuck in a heavily commercial culture, right? Um, Everybody is marketed to constantly, right? We're all under constant bombardment. Um, and so certain things have like kind of captivated people, right? I mean, the Apple marketing has created a kind of quasi-religious approach to iPhones and, the so-called Apple culture, whatever the heck Apple culture means, other than carrying around Apple products, escapes me entirely. But we still hear about Apple culture and people who would line up to be the first to buy an iPhone or something like that. Um, so you're in this commercial culture, right? And whatever audience you want to find, either you're going for a very small niche that's not already captivated by modern techno culture, or you're fitting this into the pre-existing modes, right? And something like, I could see a step in this direction being something like a phone app that you answer like maybe 100 questions on it or something, and then it that loads a chat bot, right? It presets a chat bot so that you could try to get a chat bot that sort of maybe acts like someone right? Um, and that would be a way of saying, hey, we've got this product where you can kind of still have people in your life even when they're not,
There is a
right?
company that is doing just that.
For others, as opposed to like the mind file for yourself.
Uh, it's called Eterne.me. I was reading about that last year. It was founded by some people out of MIT or perhaps Stanford. I will find their website and send it to you. It's
Okay, that'd be
quite
great. 'Cause
fascinating, but well,
I mean,
is
I think that would be the launching point for A, finding out who's interested, right? Anyone who's downloading that app is in your target audience, right? But B, in creating a target audience, which is really what, as far as I can tell, what modern marketers do is they create audiences. They don't find them,
yeah.
uh, you know, and so having a kind of step in that direction gives somebody an idea that maybe he or she, most people, even the people who sometimes talk to the deceased in their own thoughts and prayers, they probably don't usually think, hey, I could use my phone to actually do that, right? um, so by creating that opportunity, you actually kind of create a sort of target audience. But I really think if you're looking at ways to spread your idea, you're going to have to build those, nest those into the kind of commercial structures that are already dictating target audiences for everything else.
For example,
Maybe you could form a collaboration with the folks at MIT or whatever. You know, the folks who built that app. Maybe it would be a good idea to communicate with them. Say, hey, what you're doing is related to what I'm doing. What
but the
can we
thing,
do to think together?
right, but the thing is that it's not related. It's not related at all. It seems related. That's a frequent disagreement that I have with people like Bill Bambridge or Martin Rothblatt. I mean, they seem to think that the technology to do that exists now, or perhaps will exist soon. I don't buy that at all. I mean, the thing is that
No, but I think when you're
is a
building,
joke.
though,
The thing is that you cannot even start thinking of capturing the details of a human personality with sufficient resolution, not with 100 questions, not with 10,000 questions, not with a lifetime worth of questions. Things that just don't have enough bandwidth in the communication between
no,
human
I
beings.
completely agree with you.
That may happen by the end of, I mean, look, suppose by the end of next decade, have very high speed brain uh, brain to computer interfaces. I mean, much higher speed than now. Now the speed is, what must that be? Some few kilobytes per minute. If that speed were to become several exabytes per second, which is a leap of many orders of magnitude, then we could think of storing enough information, the human personality, to build a realistic replica of that person in real life. I mean, that might happen by the mid-century, end of the century, but definitely not now. I mean,
Yeah,
whoever
no, I completely
so
agree
doing
with
it
you,
right
Giuliano.
now is just cheating with the best
But
intentions, of course, but it's
what I
saying
was saying
something
is, if
that
you're,
technology cannot do.
but if what your interest is in the networking side, the who are the people with whom to communicate, then these would be the people with whom to communicate. Any technological approach right now that would in any way imitate, say, the digital resurrection of a human being. You know that I'm personally not convinced that any such approach will ever be possible, right? But when you're talking about where you want to kind of build your community, I think you have to look for the analogs that are kind of present. And it may be that those folks building that little app would love to have a kind of grand scale vision, right? That there's collaboration that might be possible, and even where it would be possible to say, hey, we're not even just interested in things like mind files. We're interested in a bigger, a quantum process, right? As part of a larger vision for what this technology could be. Um, So, and whoever's using that product is someone who at least has some level of interest in the larger issue, right? So, when you're looking at like a question of audience, I mean, if you go to traditional religious audiences, you're going to be running into too much competition. Because traditional religions already have ideas about how you might communicate with the dead, right? But if you go to a commercial audience that is already looking
No.
for, an alternate way of doing this, your vision might make the product more compelling. The product gives someone a reason to believe in your vision, and then overall, collaboratively, you, the makers, the users, could be envisioning, okay, how do we take this? How do we make progress toward the next step when we're looking at, say, the quantum archaeology side of this or what have you, right? Like how do we bring these ideas to the public? How do we advocate for them and make them more common? That was the only point I was trying to make. Not that I think that their app is in any way the equivalent of what you're hoping for. Only that there's a direction. You're running in potentially parallel lines, and if you bring those closer together, maybe there's
I
something to be
see.
had for everybody,
Yeah.
right?
I see. The thing is that
By the way, I only
to
have about 10, maybe 15 minutes at
yeah.
most.
Yeah, okay. We have all the time in the world to finish. Well, on that point, by make my perspective clearer, the thing is that if I could build Akashic technology, I would just build Akashic technology. That I cannot do that. I don't think anyone right now can do that. And I think that will remain a dream for thousands of years. It's not anything that can happen in the future that we can foresee. Um, I don't want to sell people the idea that we can build Akashic engineering now because that promise would be wrong. But I want to persuade people that perhaps descendants in the far future will be able to do that. And why do I want to do that? Because I think that can make people happy. That's the only thing I want to achieve. I mean, my ideas give a lot of happiness to me. And they give so much happiness to me that I would like to find ways to offer the same happiness to others as well. You see what I mean?
Well,
Okay, but
sometimes in religion, people have somewhat strange bedfellows. I mean, like I know I keep going back 2,000 years, but if we go 2,000 years back to the alliance that's basically formed between Peter and James on one side and Paul on the other, Peter and James believed that to be a follower of Jesus, you had to be Jewish. If
no,
you were a Gentile, you needed to convert to Judaism, and then you could follow Jesus. And Paul said, no, 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 no. You can be a Gentile and you can follow Jesus, right? And even though they fundamentally disagreed on a very important theological question, they said, well, we're going to agree to disagree on that little question. And, they tried to make it a small issue. And then they worked side by side toward what they saw as the long range project, which was, the coming of Jesus of Nazareth. The return of Jesus was what their long range goal was. And even though their short range and mid range strategies were different, and those strategies were different because of some pretty fundamental disagreements. They were still able to kind of work side by side until such time that Paul's vision became the only vision, right? The vision of Peter and James is gone by 50 to 100 years after the death of Jesus. The Jews had just decided that Jesus wasn't coming back. Those Jews who had believed he was, which was only some of them, but that had stopped being the case. And the Gentile belief became the belief, right? So sometimes parallel strategies can work, right? And so if you can list with you people also excited, people could really use, right? Especially something to be excited about rather than just the next thing to buy. I mean, I think one of the great horrors of commercial culture is people getting really, really excited about the next thing they can acquire, right? Because that doesn't work. You acquire it, and then a day later, you're just looking for the next thing to be acquired. It's a terrible strategy for developing any kind of meaningful life. And so, what you're proposing is a strategy that's a long range game, right? Like, it's not about what you can get tomorrow. It's not about what you can get 10 years from now. You may not even ever actually get the thing, but the thing is worthy of your investment because it gives you something to feel excited about in the world,
Right, and
right?
maybe the thing will come back and get you.
Yeah. I mean, it may, that like that's,
It may
there's
not.
that,
It's a hope.
it may not, but in the meantime, I mean, that's what to go back to something I said a long while ago, one of the things that I find is such an interesting overlap in your thinking and mine is that we're both really intrigued by the ways technology becomes meaning making, right? By the way we make the world a rich, beautiful, interesting place using technology. Uh, for me, that becomes an interest in how people do that, right? Like I become interested in what you're doing because you're trying to do that. And then I become interested in how that process works or how other people use science and technology to create other forms of enchantment. Um, but we both have this similar understanding that science and technology is a tool of enchantment. And I think that's one that more people really need to see so that they can pick better forms of that enchantment, right? There are better and worse ways to make the world magical. And if the way you make it magical is just by buying the next iPhone, that's not a very productive way of making the world magical. But if your way of making the world magical is to invest yourself in a process whereby you become hopeful about the future, whereby you can see the global connections of religion and science, the way you are. I mean, I can see how that vision makes you happy in a genuine kind of happy, rather than the kind of happy that comes with like, look at my cool new phone. 6 months later, it's not the cool phone anymore. That's not a genuine kind of happiness.
Exactly.
I can understand where you're coming from and why you want to share that kind of enchantment with others because it would be productive for people to have that, right? I mean, that makes sense to me. But along the way, you're probably going to have some compatriots who are in the, you know, commercial marketplace.
Interesting. Okay, since I see that you have only few minutes, let me just go quickly ahead and see what
Oh,
are the important. Ah, yes, that's an important point. How to present our ideas to the mainstream religion and science communities. How to position our ideas politically in academy and society. I'm thinking of things like, for example, I mentioned that before, if a physicist, a researcher in academy, even remotely hints at the kind of things that I'm saying in a scientific article, that would be complete career suicide. I think you agree with that. And similarly,
well,
if
but that
anyone
was
says that in
probably,
a religious circle, that will be heresy, and they will be maybe excommunicated. So it's not easy at all to find the right political balance in both religion and academy or ideas. Do you have any thoughts to offer on that point?
well, I think that to a considerable extent, the career suicide part naturally gets diffused. Um, Nowadays, if a researcher in artificial intelligence says, give me a couple decades and we're going to have, intelligent machines and brain computer interfaces and all the rest of that, nobody gets real worked up about it. 20 years ago, during one of those troughs in the AI period, maybe more like 30, 35 years ago, right? Where early AI had made all these promises and they hadn't really come to fruition, and AI didn't work very well. So there's this trough of expectation. And if you came out saying, 20 years from now, we're going to have transcendent computer brains, that would have been career suicide, right? But if you say it now, it's not. So I think that there are moments, right, in those curves where certain kinds of optimism are plausible or implausible. And so you kind of got to hit your moment, right? That even if right now physicists aren't wanting to talk, um, make radical promises, that doesn't mean that that moment is impossible, right? I don't know what would open that moment, but probably that will involve, a little bit of kind of trying to nudge. I think popular science is an important way in which these things get nudged along. Um, I think we live in a tricky time period where, one of the great achievements that Hans Moravec managed was that his first book was published by Harvard University Press in 1988. This incredible imaginative flight of fancy gets published in one of the world's most prestigious academic presses. Um, that the political power that he got from Harvard, and then his second book published by Oxford, and then again by Oxford, that created a space of opportunity. And one thing that probably is necessary to get into the scientific community and kind of wedge open the door for radical flights of fancy, kind of imaginations of what these things could do, it's going to take some pushing, and it's going to take some leveraging of allies, right? In the case of Moravec, Harvard University Press becomes an ally. Carnegie Mellon Robotics Institute is an ally, whether or not it wanted to be. Although, in fact, what I was told was that people at CMU were very impressed by and appreciative of what Moravec did, even if they didn't believe it at all, right? Like, even if they had zero belief, they still thought it was really neat the way he was trying to imagine the future and bring it to a public, right? So really what has to happen is some allies have to be brought on board that are not that you got to grab a mainstream ally or two and make them your collaborators, willingly or not. So I think that's part of the process of getting in the scientific community. Getting in the religious community seems to me less productive than harnessing what we call the generation of the nuns, right? These people who now, if you give them a checklist, are you atheist, agnostic, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, blank, 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 and then they click none, right? They'll check off none, even though atheist and agnostic are choices. Like, none of the contemporary, like, the options that they see on the table are the right ones for them. But they still sense a kind of spirituality in their lives. I mean, I would think that's the community that you want, is the people who consider themselves to be religious in some fashion and don't think any of the available descriptors are the right ones. I mean, that's where you then say that's right, because what we have is, in the
Yeah,
contemporary world, a new way of seeing and thinking and working.
I understand, and this is a very good point. Okay, I think we have almost at the end. Okay, let's skip this
Yeah, I'm
open
about to
source.
turn into a pumpkin. So how about one more question? And
Yeah, let's skip this. Yeah, about this very last one thing is that I mean, we have been very active in virtual worlds in the past, and at some point we thought that virtual worlds could be an ideal vehicle
yeah,
for the diffusion of new religious ideas. As a matter of
yeah,
fact, your second book is dedicated to that.
yeah,
Now, a few years after writing your second book and seeing that people still haven't gotten so excited from virtual worlds as we thought they would be. I mean, do we still need to think about that? And can all
yeah.
this Oculus Rift and immersive virtual reality somehow make happen in this decade what didn't happen Second Life in the
Yeah.
decade. What do you think?
So I'm in that picture. My avatar is in there. I was at that event that you
Yes,
hosted, and it was a very interesting event to me because a few years ago in Second Life, if you'd hosted an event like that about kind of the future of technology and some religious implications, and you invite someone as internationally recognized as Bill Bainbridge to speak, you would have had 50 or 60 people crammed
yes,
in there, the avatars sitting on top of each
yes,
other and everything
yeah,
else.
exactly.
And so you hosted this event, and I was stunned at how few people came.
Like
So here,
11 or
so
12
here,
people.
the my thoughts. One, I think that virtual worlds leverage people to think in futurist terms all by themselves. Are they a great communication medium for those ideas? That I'm less sure about, right? I'm less sure that uh, that they're. I mean, think back to mid 20th century. There were people who believed that they were going to distribute Christianity using rocket technology. That the space program was actually greatly influenced by a number of people, such as Werner von Braun, who believed that there was a kind of Christian mission in space technology. Now, that's like that idea is kind of ludicrous to us now, but one of the interesting things is that space technology itself does create a certain kind of religious vision, a vision of cosmic scope, of global collaboration, of spreading humanity beyond the solar system. There's a kind of religious vision that's built into the technology that's actually more powerfully connected to the technology than the idea that you could use the technology to spread a particular religious vision. So the virtual worlds, I think they do come with a prepackaged kind of religious vision that they do in fact share with users. But whether they're serving well as a medium, that's a more difficult question, right? Now, could they still? Space technology is never going to be a great way to spread Christian evangelism. I mean, that was just a pretty bizarre idea. Um, but virtual world technologies are specifically communicative media, right? The idea is that you can get people there and they can communicate with one another. And so, in that sense, they should still work. But right now, we are definitely in a kind of trough of participation. Uh, Second Life still has lots and lots of users, but the breadth of its user base is much diminished. Like what those people want from Second Life is much narrower than it once was. And I think that goes back to one of your earlier points about early community enthusiasms, that there were people who had a lot of excitement in the early years of Second
Yes.
Life, and they were really excited about all that could be done with it.
Okay, but
And as
now,
and so now it's more narrow.
yeah, but now
Um,
we are going to get to this new Second Life project Sansar with Oculus Rift and all that, and high
I am
fidelity. And
skeptical.
does that change anything? You're skeptical.
I doubt it.
You doubt.
I'm skeptical that there'll be this host of new people in the second generation of virtual worlds who are now going to invest themselves in the kind of conversational space, the opportunities for sharing ideas. I think the people who were really committed to that already tried it in Second Life, and they might come into these new virtual worlds. And it might be that if the new virtual worlds work well enough, that some of those people will stay. I mean, a big part of Second Life was that it was so clunky and was so frustrating to a lot of users. And Linden Lab wasn't making that experience better. The company behind Second Life was not making Second Life a more user friendly experience. And I think that led to attrition among some of those people who had all the excitement. Some of those people who were really enthusiastic about what could be done and then they found they couldn't even walk through a room comfortably, and then they became disappointed. So if the new technologies work a lot better, some of those excited people might be back in them saying, okay, now we can do it. But I'm not really sure because they may be kind of disillusioned about that technology. uh, I don't know. I mean, it's not where I've been in terms of, my research and my thinking and my interviewing and that sort of thing. uh, it'll be, I guess, an interesting question whether the excitement can be uh, rekindled. I mean, I would jump on it
Yeah.
if those new communities, if those new technologies open up really good community spaces and people are back in them and back and excited at them,
Oh, I'm
then
looking forward to that. That should happen toward the end of the year, I believe, and I'm certain. I mean, I'm really waiting for that. Let's see what happens. Okay, I think now is the moment to let you go.
okay,
Since you have to go, I want to thank you very much. You have dedicated a couple of hours to this conversation.
it was
And
my pleasure, Giulio. It's
to
always
the
nice to talk to
viewers,
you.
I want to remind you that Robert will be a speaker at our India Awakens conference in Kolkata, India on February 12. When I will share this video, I will also share information about the conference, and I hope you will contribute fundraiser to make it happen. So let's thank Robert very much, and I'm going
Thank you
to
for all the work you're doing,
stop
Giulio.
video recording now. Thank you again, Robert.